Right, my name is Jackie O'Reilly. I'm the President-elect of SASE for next year, and it is a real pleasure to chair this presidential address with Professor Sigrid Quack on the topic of the pandemic as a historical conjuncture, understanding the present and imagining the future. Sigrid has had a very long and rich intellectual journey with very significant contributions to comparative political economy across a range of diverse topics. In her initial research in the 1980s and 90s on the dynamics of part-time work in Britain and Germany, her research was really at the forefront of labour market studies, drawing on quite complex comparative data from the British and German household panel study. This was published to wide recognition, and since then she went on to study financial organisations, transnationality and global governance. Her work focuses on conceptualising the interaction between organisational practices and politics. And some of her many publications include some significant books on transnational communities and globalisation and institutions with Marie-Laure Dijalik, and more recently her collaboration on transnational Arbeit with Schultz-Schaefer, Karin Scheiern-Weiss. Her research has spanned a range of issues around regulation and governance related to copyright, open access, financial reporting, the regulation of multinational companies, environmentalism and labour rights. She has some new projects on creativity and intellectual property rights in pharma and music. They have also been published on her researchgate.net if you want to look at them. And Sigrid has always been a source of really vibrant ideas, taking on really challenging issues, both conceptually and empirically, in the history of the work she's conducted over her career. She's currently director of the Centre for Global Cooperation and Research, who've also sponsored this conference, and professor of comparative sociology at the University of Duisberg-Essen in Germany. She previously worked at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin. She's been a visiting fellow at the Stockholm Center for Organizational Research, at Brown University in the US, at École Normale Supérieure Cachin, and at the University of Cambridge, which is a reflection of the intellectual span and scope of her work. I would also like, before she gives her lecture now, to offer her, on behalf of all of us, a massive thank you for the enormous contribution she has made in her year as president. Following on from the virtual conference last year, the association faced some very significant financial challenges, and Sigrid has gone beyond the call of duty in working out solutions to deal with these, and she's done it extraordinarily effectively. So we have so much to thank her for. Her work has put the association on a financially stable trajectory, and she has worked really inclusively and collaboratively with a range of different members and organisations across the association. And also want to say one of the kind of admirable characteristics of Sigrid's style of working together has been reflected in her involvement in the equality and diversity group within the association, that has really core to the way she's tried to manage some of these things and to make the association welcoming and inclusive for a broader range of new scholars coming in. So we have very much to thank her for, and Sigrid, we are really looking forward to hearing your lecture today. Thank you very much.
So much for your very kind words, Jackie, and very warm words. Thank you so much. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. I will first share my screen and hope, thank you, everything will work technically. So today I will speak about the pandemic as a historical conjuncture, understanding the present, imagining the future. The COVID-19 pandemic, called the biggest public health and economic disaster in our time, in the words of historian Peter Baldwin, has shaken our lives and our economic, social, and political orders very deeply. Not only has the pandemic led to the most severe global economic downturn since the Great Depression, by far overshadowing the recession following the financial crisis of 2008. The pandemic has also disrupted and overturned deep-seated practices in our everyday life worlds. It has shaken long-established ways of organizing in companies, industries, and global supply chains. And it has provoked a questioning of established growth models and sparked a return to the state, at least in some parts of the world. It has also put into question some core beliefs of neoliberal capitalism, ranging from global free movement, free play of markets, and unlimited exploitation of nature. At the same time, it has posed the most serious challenge to global cooperation since the Second World War. So the COVID-19 pandemic, in my view, raises far-reaching questions about the longer-term developments and outcomes. Are we witnessing a confluence of structural forces that limit future possibilities and shape future action? Or are we in the midst of a historical opening for significant political change that might push the world onto a different and perhaps more sustainable pathway of socio-economic development? In this talk, I will address these questions from an institutionalist perspective. I will propose the concept of a historical conjuncture to examine the confluence of multiple contradictory developments that have been magnified and amplified during the worldwide pandemic crisis. I will argue that the ways in which actors have made sense of the present and imagined the future, as far as they could, have shaped significantly the variety of policy responses that we see so far, and that this variety can be explained in turn to a significant degree by reference to past experiences. A word of caution is in place. Like any other social scientist, I do not have the crystal ball that can show us the future. Answers to these questions can only be preliminary, as we are still in the midst of the pandemic. So the question mark after COVID in the title of this year's conference is appropriate and still valid. The best we can do is to analyze developments as they unfold, while recognizing that the future is open and undetermined. Many commentators have referred to the pandemic as a critical juncture. Interestingly, policy practitioners as well as scholars have done so, though with different meanings. Leaders of the World Health Organization have repeatedly used the term to emphasize the urgency of taking measures to prevent the even more exponential spread of the virus. In their understanding, a critical juncture refers to a moment where urgent action is required before the window for such action closes. In the social sciences, critical juncture is typically used in a diametrically opposed way, as a moment at which an established path opens up to possible alternatives. A variety of scholars, activists, and politicians have characterized the pandemic as opening up policy space for change in this sense. This second usage of the concept has the benefit of highlighting a temporary openness to change. A critical juncture thus forms part of exogenously driven institutional rupture. Long periods of path-dependent stability are suddenly interrupted by a contingent event that opens up a transitory opportunity space for new ideas and change coalitions to emerge. Existing rules of the game are called into question, making significant institutional change more likely before choices taken are reinforced again by positive feedback mechanisms that make it hard to reverse them. But does the pandemic really represent an external shock and a sudden rupture in the sense of a critical juncture? I will argue that the analogy is misleading in two respects. First, it depends very much on the frame of reference adopted whether the pandemic is to be regarded as an exogenous or endogenously generated rupture. For those who see the pandemic as an academic feature of the exploitative human nature nexus in advanced capitalism, Endogenous developments, when rather an exogenous shock, are the cause. From this perspective, COVID-19 is the latest outbreak in a series of infectious zoonotic diseases transferred from wild animals to humans, fostered by urbanization, land exploitation, and human encroachment into wild areas. However, if one focuses on specific policy fields and their respective institutions, let's say economic and fiscal policy, the pandemic might be well considered as an exogenous shock, which triggered a crisis, opening new opportunity spaces to reconsider the relation between state and markets. In many other cases, it's even harder to decide whether the pandemic was an exogenous or an endogenous factor. Take, for example, national healthcare systems. While the spread of COVID was an exogenous pressure on healthcare systems of the countries to which it spread, it soon amplified pre-existing shortages in medical equipment and personnel that significantly contributed to the healthcare crisis during the pandemic. From this perspective, the distinction between exogenous and endogenous factors appears superfluous. Second, the temporal assumptions of the critical conjuncture model of path dependency do not capture the confluence of interrelated developments of different speeds that we observed during the pandemic. Theories of incremental institutional change, prominently developed by our colleagues Mahoney, Theron, and Strake, and others, have questioned for a long time the strong distinction between before and after a critical juncture. They see continuity and change more as endpoints of a continuum rather than clearly distinctive states, with a focus on endogenous processes that can gradually undermine institutional structures or add transformative layers to existing institutions. Certainly, we have seen some of these processes during the pandemic. There has been, for example, a redeployment and reinterpretation of short-term work benefits at the national level and the introduction of a European layer thereof with the SURE program. Yet a focus on endogenous sources of gradual change can only partly capture the complex dynamics that unfold if we acknowledge the openness and interrelatedness of institutional domains. In previous joint work with Marie-Laure Jeldic, we observed that path transformation in open systems often cannot be traced to clearly identifiable single ruptures. A single radical and abrupt jump from one stage to another becomes less likely the more we take into account institutional interdependence across policy fields and social spatial scales. As these are not separated containers, the developments in one policy arena or transnational layer are likely to influence others in unintended ways, depending on the degree of interconnectedness or insulation between them. This leads me to suggest the term historical conjuncture as a useful lens to analyze the pandemic from the perspective of institutional theory. I use this term to describe the confluence of cross-cutting pressures for change, each unfolding with its own temporal dynamic in a relatively condensed period of time. In their coming together, these crossing pressures evoke processes of collective sense-making that are informed by historical and future imaginations, and thereby generate an exceptionally open policy space, a space for reflection, if you want so, with the potential for institutional change. The key characteristic of a historical conjuncture is the complexity of these intertwined processes of different temporal orders. While the root cause of problems here, COVID-19, the first infection, may have arisen in a specific policy domain or local location, it's likely to subsequently affect adjacent policy domains and transnational scales through trickle sideways, trickle up, and trickle down pressures. These spillover effects are causally and temporally complex, and because they unfold with different speeds and potentially feedback on each other. While a historical conjuncture opens up opportunities for institutional change, not least in fields with overdue problems that, accelerated by other pressures, might reach a tipping point, this is not an automatism that would lead to transformation. The urgency and complexity of the overall situation might equally foster conservatism and regression. I think we are therefore likely to see different and contradictory developments unfolding at the same time, the tensions between which might only work themselves out in the long term. These are the features that make a historical conjuncture so extremely challenging to analyze, not only for activists and policymakers, but also for scholars. A historical conjuncture is like a multitude of smaller and larger streams meandering in an ample and moving riverbed, as illustrated by this photograph, that eventually, over a longer period of time, might become channeled into more clearly discernible flows. Historical conjunctures are not objective facts, because there are periods of protracted and creeping uncertainty. They require collective interpretation as a prerequisite for collective action and problem solving. To understand whether and how the pandemic may be given rise to institutional change, we therefore first of all need to analyze how the actors involved have made sense of this historical conjuncture. What problems were foregrounded or left out of the picture? How were intersections between policy domains acknowledged or disregarded in public discourses and policy responses? And how was the transboundary nature of the pandemic admitted or denied, and with what consequences? Historical conjunctures are also invitations to rethink the present for the future. Alternative imaginations of the future can, as shown in joint work with Katja Freistein, Bettina Mahlert, and Christine Unrau, have important mobilizing and also legitimizing effects for cross-domain and transboundary cooperation. But they can also undermine it or prevent it. Identifying how future imaginations for a post-pandemic world foreground or downplay interdependencies across policy domains and scales will help us to better understand the potential and the limits for transformative change. None of these activities is done from scratch. We know that the present sense-making and future imaginations are embedded in a web of pre-existing knowledge infrastructures, policy paradigms, and structural inequalities. In situations of high uncertainty, such as the pandemic, historical imaginaries are often mobilized to highlight analogies, construct narratives, or draw lessons by referring to previous crises. Understandings of the present can vary significantly depend on which memories are mobilized or not, as imaginations of the future do. Yet understandings of the present and imaginations of the future are not predetermined by the past. The creeping nature of the pandemic, and I think Hartmut Rosa described this very nicely yesterday in his lecture, with its recurrently shifting problems, both demands and provides opportunities for reflexivity, policy learning, and reform initiatives. Therefore, historical conjunctures are likely to give rise to a multiplicity of socio-economic activities with different time horizons, which co-evolve, compete, oppose, and challenge each other in long, twisted processes that may eventually generate new policy directions and transformative institutional change. In the remainder of this talk, I will illustrate my arguments by drawing on the steadily growing body of secondary literature, policy reports, and press coverage. And it has taken me quite a bit of time to follow that. It was a challenge because it's also constantly changing and evolving. I will provide examples of contradictory trends in how actors made sense of the crisis and how they started to imagine the future. Let's start with how they sought to understand the present. When Netflix launched its documentary series entitled pandemic, on the 22nd of January 2020, 3 weeks after China had officially reported the first cases of COVID-19, most viewers still took it as an alarmist dystopian account. Even after the first cases were diagnosed in France, Italy, and the US shortly thereafter, politicians did not seem to fully understand the transboundary threat. Yet the Netflix series was a documentary. It was not a science fiction. It drew strongly on more than a decade of scientific reporting on the increase of new infectious diseases, often of the zoonotic origins. In the documentary, global health officials and researchers reiterated their earlier warnings that a pandemic was coming and that the world was insufficiently prepared. Even though the World Health Organization had revised its global framework for managing pandemic outbreaks in 2019, member states asked the member states to take precautions. And even after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 an international public health emergency at the end of January, leaders in Europe and the Americas continued to proclaim that things were under control throughout January, February, and even into March 2020. And I've taken here a quote from our German health minister, Jens Spahn, and deliberately not from Boris Johnson or from Trump, who said at the end of January that the COVID virus is less harmful than an influenza, and we are prepared. To give him credit, he revised his position much more quickly than other policy leaders. The underestimation of the threat by politicians and leaders and wait-and-see politics were quickly bypassed by the global spread of the disease. And you see here the data in an interval for basically 3 months. The overall policy response in the global north was what Boyne and others in a very good book from 2021 observe, a long incubation period with a sudden punctuation. That punctuation occurred when infection curves spiked up in North America and Europe in March and April 2020. What followed was a rapid nationalization of public health responses. The prevailing and largely unquestioned view was that the global health crisis urgently required national responses to protect national citizens. Given the many unknowns, scientific experts, such as epidemiologists, virologists, but as the pandemic went on, also economists, even sociologists, psychologists, played a key role in debates on appropriate public health responses. Each government had its own national advisory body and also often their own personal national advisors, as you can see here on this slide. Particularly at the beginning, expert advice relied on assumptions about the spread of known respiratory diseases that later turned out not to apply to the COVID-19 virus. Evidence-based rather than precautionary decision-making led to a slow uptake of new research findings, such as, for example, the likelihood of transmission through aerosols at short distances in the US public health advice. You saw also really different advice coming from experts. It was not unified. Within states, the cross-domain implications of the pandemic were rapidly recognized and acted upon in many cases. Already in March and April, governments in leading OECD countries announced measures for economic, employment, and educational support. Yet, as the pandemic dragged on, with many countries in Europe and in Americas going into extended lockdowns, pressures for reopening arose that often generated undesirable interdomain feedback effects on the infection curves. Pressures to reopen for tourism, for example, often led to new surges of infection. At the same time, as I said, we saw that stark nationalization of public health responses that went hand in hand with uncoordinated unilateral border closures, predominantly in the previously border-free Schengen area in Europe. It went hand in hand with uncoordinated distancing and contagion measures in previously closely integrated border regions, and the absence or the belated use of existing cross-border mechanisms for early warning in cases of transboundary health threats. I think faced with the nightmare of uncontrollability, as Hartmut Rosa called it in his yesterday lecture, politicians fell back on control attempts in the sovereign borders of nation states. And as they had to impose restrictive measures on their citizens, including interference with civil rights, through the various lockdowns, they seem to have been drawn more and more into a national legitimacy spiral, where the well-being of their own citizens took priority of those in neighboring countries or other parts of the world. The focus on the nation state as a container in response to the transboundary health crisis was also reflected in the linguistic use of war metaphors by politicians like Macron in France, practices of blaming the other, as well as by Trump's insistence of calling the disease a Chinese virus, and strategies of othering, which led, for example, to verbal and physical attacks against citizens of Asian descent in the US and protests against it, as you see here. Still, policy responses and transboundary coordination varied across world regions and over time. They were different in countries with recent experiences of epidemic outbreaks. There, SARS, MERS, and Ebola had left a strong mark in collective memory and led to improvements in alert and preventive infrastructures. East Asian countries enacted precautious and stringent measures at an early stage. The African Union and the newly established African CDC effectively coordinated early response and mobilized community-based prevention measures across member states. Here, past experiences made it much easier for politicians and publics in these countries to imagine how the transboundary transmission of a virus could outpace preventive measures if taken too reluctantly and insufficiently coordinated. What matters here to me is that in many parts of the world, the morphing character of the pandemic was fueled by sometimes unintended and often undesired effects of weak cross-domain coordination within countries, but even more so by the absence and the delay of transboundary cooperation across countries. As a result, governments' policy responses often took unexpected turns that are difficult to explain in a comparative framework that examines countries as independently responding to a common global challenge in their respective institutional setting. In contrast, looking through a historical conjuncture lens draws our focus towards how interconnections and mutual influences between domains and countries were taken into consideration by policymakers, along with the often and undesirable feedback effects from ignoring them. As the pandemic went on, discussions turned towards what a post-pandemic future should or could look like. I will here speak about two aspects: economic recovery and global immunization. As ever more countries went into lockdown during the early months of 2020, governments realized that this was not only a public health, but also an economic crisis. Unlike public health responses, emergency stabilization measures for the economy were taken quite early by national, regional, and global bodies, some of them also in concert with each other. Just to give a few examples. National governments and central banks in leading OECD countries introduced fiscal and employment relief measures, as well as loan for businesses already in February and March 2020. Many of these were later transformed into more ambitious recovery programs. Among regional organizations, the African and Asian development banks created new response facilities to provide governments and businesses with pandemic response loans. The African Union launched a COVID response fund in March 2020, for which it mobilized funding from the World Bank, IMF, and EU. By April 2021, it had dispersed more than $3.7 billion. In the EU, a temporary suspension of fiscal deficit and state aid rules, subsidies for short-time work, and the ECB's pandemic emergency purchasing program sought to stabilize the economy and financial markets. At the global level, World Bank, IMF, and G20 offered emergency financing and suspended debt repayments for developing countries. The UN set up a COVID-19 response and recovery fund in April 20, aimed at providing $2 billion for COVID-related measures in low-income countries. Yet, member states' commitments have fallen short of the initial target. In March 2021, the IMF finally, after a gestation period, announced an increase of $605 billion in special drawing rights, the biggest increase in its history. Still, many say that this is still insufficient to meet Africa's needs unless richer countries voluntarily redistribute their surplus SDRs. And the deeper issue of debt restructuring for the developing countries still remain unresolved. So while this is a rather mixed bag then, particularly with regard to global redistribution, what stands out in my view is the most ambitious of these initiatives, that they are more than a stimulus package. They rather seek to rebuild economies in a more equitable and greener way, thus also the building back better. A common slogan, the building back better, signals that there is a vision for economic recovery that is not just going back to where we were before the pandemic. Originating in UN disaster management, this slogan, you can say, or this image, this vision during the pandemic has traveled quickly to global, regional, and national policy arenas. Other terms are the New Green Deal, Next Generation EU, or the Resilient and Green Recovery. While these are rather loose concepts, they nevertheless address the need to integrate recovery measures across different domains, including public health, economic, environmental, and social policies. They also seek to tackle long-standing problems magnified by the pandemic, such as environmental degradation, income inequality, and inadequate care services. Exemplary here are the Biden recovery program in the US and the Next Generation Recovery and Resilience Package in the European Union. Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill and the various contested infrastructure bills seek to foster research and development, green the economy through investments in renewable energy, generate employment through expanding the care sector, and reduce inequality through cash benefits for families. Criticized for not being radical enough in taxing the very wealthy, the recovery program still signals a break with the orthodoxy of minimal state spending and leave it all to the market policies. Similarly, the Next Generation EU 750 billion euro package, which earmarks 37% for investments in greening and digitalization, has been hailed as a paradigmatic shift towards a common borrowing, enhanced fiscal capacity, and cross-border transfers within the European Union. What matters here to me is a shift in policy ideas. Previously dominant macroeconomic and fiscal policies and their underlying assumptions are being reconsidered and replaced with alternative ones. It is fair to say that many of these changes have been already on their way as a result of learning from earlier failures of crisis response and a reorientation of parts of the economics profession towards more heterodox approaches, as well as new economic thinking entering think tanks, ministries, and international organizations. However, the pandemic has vastly accelerated these shifts. To be clear, this is not about reinventing capitalism. This is also not about brand new visions, as many of the proposals are not new, but have been picked up from earlier failed or not pursued projects. Many of the programs are temporarily limited. So far, commitments in projects seeking to address the needs of the poorest countries have fallen far behind what they envisioned. But it is a beginning, and we know from historical research that temporarily limited programs adopted in war and crisis situations have often left lasting institutional impacts. The reorientation of macroeconomic and fiscal policies towards greater equity and greening signals a potential for more long-term institutional change. Such a transformative potential is much less visible in another policy area that I will speak about before coming to the end of my lecture. It's equally crucial for the recovery from the pandemic, global access to vaccines. As soon as the vision of herd immunity had been rejected on economic and moral grounds, the collective narrative shifted towards vaccination as the pathway towards a post-pandemic future in which everybody would be able to return to normalcy, whatever that means. Vaccines raise great hopes for tackling and subsequently ending the pandemic. The development of new vaccines in a year's time, whereas typically it might take 15 years, has been celebrated as an outstanding achievement of science, industry, government cooperation. However, the organizing of the vaccination campaign has proven very challenging and revealed appalling global inequalities in access to vaccines. It became soon clear that vaccination for all meant very different things in different parts of the world, with devastating effects in terms of infections and deaths in the global south. By now, 3 billion vaccinations have been administered globally, and 23% of the world population has received at least one dose. Yet, 85% of these doses went to high and upper middle income countries and only 0.3% to low income countries. As a result, the rate of fully vaccinated people varies, as you can see from this graph, between 50 or more % in a few countries like the UK, US, Israel, and interestingly also Chile and Uruguay, and then less 1% in lower income countries. In light of these enormous inequalities, debates about the best pathways towards immunization are becoming highly contested and politicized. I will discuss 3 pathways. The dominant imagination guiding policy responses is that of vaccines as a private good, produced by pharma companies which protect intellectual property through patents and sell their products on the global market. In practice, however, the development and production of COVID-19 vaccines was massively subsidized by governments and philanthropic foundations through grants and so-called advanced market commitments. AMCs are meant to provide pharma companies with incentives to invest in R&D, scale up production, and make them available to poorer countries at below market prices. In practice, however, rich countries have used AMCs to procure several times what they need, disadvantaging poorer ones. Yet the promise that the market will foster sufficient production of vaccines because intellectual property rights and subsidies provide the right incentives has not become true. Share prices for mRNA vaccine developers have been rocketing, and different sources report 9 additional vaccine billionaires since the beginning of the pandemic. Current estimates expect this market to be valued at approximately $25 billion in the year 2024, while growing demand for governments global and with growing demands from governments, global and regional health bodies. While some pharma companies, such as AstraZeneca and others, have pledged to provide the vaccines on a non-profit basis until the pandemic ends, others have not done so. Many of the reasons for the scarcity of vaccines are endemic to the idea of market-based provision of vaccines as private goods. The competition between countries with differential purchasing power, supply chain bottlenecks created by lack of coordination, companies' reluctance to license patents and transfer knowledge to other producers even if they would pay for it, and particularly in the global south. Delays and underuse of manufacturing capacity resulting from regulatory uncertainty. This brings me to the second vision for global immunization, market-based redistribution of vaccines. The challenge of equitable distribution of vaccines was recognized early on by the World Health Organization and other international organizations. They envisaged the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator in April 2020 as a framework for procuring and redistributing tests, treatments, vaccines among member states. The COVAX, its best known pillar, was created in mid-2020. It aimed to produce vaccines and distribute them equitably to 2 billion people worldwide by the end of 2021, an estimated 20% of each participating country's population, including frontline healthcare workers and other vulnerable groups. The plan was for the WHO member states to procure the vaccines jointly through COVAX so that redistribution was possible. Yet, as COVAX was constructed in line with current modes of global health governance, whose funding follows an international model depending on the benevolence of rich donors, this vision for equitable distributions faltered quickly. Rich Western countries, such as the US and UK, followed by the EU, signed purchase agreements directly with vaccine manufacturers, often located in their own jurisdiction, sidestepping COVAX. As a result, COVAX vaccine procurement for developing countries, including current COVID-19 hotspots, has fallen behind, as you can see on this slide, and deliveries are likely to be pushed into 2022, 3, and maybe even 2024. We have seen quite a bit of protest against this combined failure of the market to provide sufficient vaccines and COVAX framework to redistribute them. So what you see here is a sand portrait created by activists and artists on the beach of Cornwall, calling on the G7 leaders to share the vaccines and waive the patents. And we are experiencing a heated discussion within the EU whether that is a good idea or not. Let me say a few words on the last vision. The third one, the open source pharma movement and community, advocates a third and more radical approach, building a global commons of knowledge and technology that would be freely accessible for the development and upscaling of vaccines. Following open source principles applied in the software industry, this movement argues that vaccines should be seen as a common good. Open access to vaccine formulas, clinical trials, production technology and know-how, and rapid sharing thereof is envisioned as to facilitate a faster increase in the quantity of vaccine production capacity around the world. The Open Source Pharma Foundation states that it's about to launch a Phase 3 clinical trial with Harvard and the government of India for its openly and collaboratively developed COVID-19 vaccine named OpenVax. So if that would go forward, it would be it would demonstrate that a real alternative is possible, but results are still pending. So this version of global vaccine commons goes beyond claims for temporarily waiving patents. It challenges the inefficiency of the existing innovation systems, excessive focus on competition and exclusivity, by highlighting the waste of time and money, as well the underuse of existing capacity arising from the current intellectual property regime and restrictive licensing practices of big pharma. And empirical studies show that the need to employ costly legal experts and proprietary databases to identify existing patterns can inhibit and significantly delay research, development, and production of vaccines in low and middle-income countries, as does Big Pharma's limited willingness to transfer technology. So while this last vision of a global vaccine commons is still marginal in policy and public debates, it starts to be picked up by international organizations as the OECD here, for example. So it comes with the recommendations for governments and international organizations to create incentives for sharing intellectual property rights and fostering knowledge transfers by making these binding conditions for access to public funding. So I come to my conclusion. In this lecture, I have proposed the concept of historical conjuncture as a useful lens to analyze past, present, and future institutional developments in the pandemic. I have shown how this concept captures complex intersections of cross-domain and transscalar processes that unfold with different temporalities. I have illustrated how the ways in which actors make sense of the present inform their policy responses and non-responses, some of which critically contributed to the spread of the pandemic, and led them to conceive the situation not only as a global health crisis, but also a global economic crisis. Similarly, failed attempts to contain the disease early on turned imaginations of pathways towards immunization against the pathogen that remains strongly contested to date. These chains of policy responses were by no means natural, the only ones that could have unfolded. They were instead shaped by how actors perceived, categorized, and evaluated the brute facts, to speak with Searle, of the pandemic in its health, economic, and social dimensions. At the same time, confronted with the unforeseeability and uncontrollability of unfolding events, actors had to revise their assumption and reevaluate policies in the light of new brute facts as they emerged. I argue that this created openness for institutional recombination and new renewal, of which we don't know the outcomes yet, because it's still ongoing. So my conclusion is that the potential for transformative change is most pronounced where actors can build on learning from past crisis experiences and also draw on established transversal policy networks and institutions to address urgent cross-domain and transboundary problems. And I see that more in the domain of economic recovery than I see it in the vaccine development. Is this relevant for institutional theory beyond the pandemic? I think yes. The pandemic is an extreme example of a broader phenomenon that characterizes contemporary institutional systems. An analysis of how actors make sense of ongoing processes of transboundary interconnectedness across policy domains and governance scales can help to explain how long-term creeping problems can reach a threshold or a tipping point where they move to the front of the policy agenda. Conversely, it can show that where these interconnections are ignored, policy agendas remain stalled and change more slowly. Looking at the pandemic as a historical conjuncture also calls into question long-established binary oppositions between exogenous and endogenous sources of ruptures and incremental change. A final verdict on the outcomes remains to be undertaken by future scholars looking back after the fact. We are still in the midst of the pandemic. Optimistic and pessimistic scenarios will have to meet the test of future developments. Institutionalists and historians writing a generation from now will understand better the twists and turns that the biggest public health crisis and economic disaster in our time will still likely take. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Sigrid, on behalf of everybody. I think, it's a characteristic Sigrid Quack contribution. It's really rich empirical data that is extremely valuable to all of us who've lived through this, but you've brought it all together. And secondly, you also provide us with a conceptual analysis of how to interpret this evidence and the relationship between actors and institutions in governing this. Okay, I've got a couple of people who I've got some questions in the Q&A. Could the tech team tell me, can these people actually ask them themselves live, or do I have to read them out?
I think you have to read them out, Jackie.
I have to read them out. Okay, well, they're a bit tricky, some of these, because they're quite long. And before I read them out, I'm going to ask a quick one myself, which is, you talked about neglected interdependencies and undesirable feedbacks. And this is a bit of a provocation, but with my Brexit hat on, much as I don't like Brexit, but have to live through it, some of the European Union's reaction to the vaccine rollout was, shall we say, not exactly very helpful. And I just wanted to ask you a quickie, which is, how do you interpret the way the European Union reacted to the way the Brits got a big share of the vaccines? And did you think their reaction was a knee-jerk, kind of unaware of the interdependencies of how to make German vaccines required lipids from Hull, which if they put a ban, they wouldn't actually be able to make their own vaccines? But maybe you can save that for a moment. Can I? And then I'll make sure I get the other ones in, because so Jeffrey Wood has asked, what I find interesting is that, as has happened in the past many times, there is an increasing blowback from the natural world. The latter is about absolutes compared to political economy, which is at least in part socially constructed. I think this is the question. So would you think the greatest risk is policymakers responding in the way they have become accustomed to, through social reconstructions rather than taking the material world seriously? That's quite a difficult question to ask. And I'll also ask the other one from Giorgio, so you have a little time to think about them. They're in the Q&A if you want to read them. So Giorgio Romano asks, you did not mention as one of the global stimuluses for the Build Back Better and Third C, besides COVID and climate, the China challenge is very present in all talks of Biden. Tensions between the US and China have increased a lot during COVID, and China has been a main supplier of vaccines in the third world. Example, Sao Paulo is producing Sinovacs with technology transfer. Any thoughts on this? That's a nice, complicated and challenging question, but let's have another one he's put in as well. You mentioned the changes will not end capitalism, but could it mean the end of neoliberalism in the advanced capitalist world, not in the periphery? Thanks. Great questions, Giorgio and Jeff. Right, if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Apparently I'm not allowed to let you speak for yourselves, but Sigrid, over to you. How do you handle those?
Yeah, before I go into the answers, I have to ask back, Jackie, I apologize, because the iPad I was using to have my text on started to ringing, so I had to put it out of the room. And that's why I didn't really hear the full second part of, I think, the second question. Could you, I mean, it started with blowbacks from the natural world, but I didn't get it fully, so sorry.
Okay. So Jeffrey Woods asked, would you think the greatest risk is policymakers responding in the way they have become accustomed to, i.e. through social reconstructions, rather than take the material world seriously? I'm not sure I completely understand. So will they just end up doing the same thing as they've always done? Is that
yeah,
Jeff?
I will try to deal with that. Okay. So I think I start from the end. Of course, we are discussing whether this is the end of neoliberalism or not, you know, and I don't think we know yet. We are in the middle of it. And the key argument of my lecture is that we see change processes and, you know, also resistance to change and you know, at the same time, and a mingling up in complicated way. And the idea of this historical conjuncture leading potentially to institutional change is the one that this institutional change would come around not as a rupture and not as a big project, but as, you know, policy changes leading one to the other and sometimes, you know, reinforcing each other or sometimes blocking each other. So in that sense, I'm sorry to say I don't know the answer, but I would say is that we as scholars also need to be careful not to project the past into the future, you know, and we have a tendency to think in our, you know, prefixed categories. And I would say we see here significant changes in some parts of the world, that put into question really underlying principles of neoliberalism. You know, a very thin state that is not investing in the economy. We see here the opposite. You know, we see put into question certain consideration about fiscal stimulus, etc. Right, on a really massive basis. It's not just ideas; it's also money. And I would say there's certainly a difference of that in, you know, if we look in different world regions. If we go back to Alexis Kentekelini's lecture on the first day, you know, we saw a very critical assessment of what the IMF is doing. So Alexis is much more a specialist in that area than I am, but I take it that these developments also vary by world region. And so I would say we see beginnings of it, and we see them in the US certainly, and we see them in Europe. They might also apply to different elements of neoliberalism to different extents. And there is an opening that we have a kind of paradigmatic shift, but it's not yet there.
Sigrid,
about world politics.
Sigrid, could I just ask you to stop sharing your screen so that we have a view?
Sorry for that. Yeah,
it's okay.
Sorry. So the question of world politics. Yeah, I mean, there are also this contradictory, or I mean, tensions in these approaches. You know, you see the policy shift in the US. At the same time, you see very much my country first policy in the vaccine provision, you know, because the US has not been exporting any of its produced vaccines, you know. It's now donating. It's in favor of waiving the patent. And it has been, as you mentioned in your question, really instrumentally or strategically been using discussions about vaccines and vaccine policies in the sense of old world, you know, world order politics, you know, building up China as the enemy. And of course, China and other countries have been delivering vaccines to developing countries that were cut off by receiving them through other channels. So there is a real material issue here that is played out in terms of world politics. And we need to see where this goes. You know, if this leads to an increasing confrontation, it might not be very productive. Yeah, and might lead to developments that undermine also the efforts to contain the pandemic. So the blowback against natural work and social reconstruction, here I'm not 100% sure. I mean, what I wanted to argue was that even the way the pandemic is perceived, it's really there. I mean, there's no question. It's not just a social construction, right? It's out there. But how its root causes are identified, and that maybe leads me also back to the word politics, because the interesting thing is Biden has brought up this theory about the virus escaping from the laboratory in China as part of this, you know, big politics strategy. And the alternative understanding is that basically there are exploitative forces in our economic models in capitalism that have pushed over the last 2 decades in certain ways that these kind of zoonotic diseases have become more likely to jump over. We don't know when and where and which one, but the frequency has certainly increased according to statistics. And so I'm saying of course, the real world is hitting back, but what the reaction to it, I mean, the policy reaction is a very different one if you take serious that it's also a human nature nexus, because then you need to take other policies to prevent further pandemics, as if you think it's a virus escaped from a laboratory. Has it escaped from a laboratory, then you need to change, you know, the policies under which laboratories operate. And maybe last to Jackie's question here, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, are you talking about when the EU was discussing export bans to the UK? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think that it's a difficult issue. But I mean, if there had been cross-border coordination from the beginning through COVAX, You wouldn't have come into these situations where certain countries don't export and others start about discussing export bans. Yeah, so I mean, it's a follow-up of the lack of coordination in the face of a global pandemic, to think that the right way is to first vaccinate your own population. So why does it stop at the border, our concern for humans? I mean, I don't want to be normative and become moral, but that's not natural. I mean, there is something there that we need to think about, right? And I think within the EU, it's even more obvious how suddenly borders between Poland and Germany, where you have a very high integration of everyday life, were closed because that was the previous administrative border that politicians in need of control referred to in the crisis because they couldn't think about a better solution. But I mean, that was not necessarily where the virus was to be contained. The border was there and was used because it was there. And there were also immediately protests against it. So, I mean, for me, that's a kind of follow-up sequencer from the lack of coordination in the first place. And it was certainly, since the vaccination production is highly globally, at least cross-border integrated, all the ingredients that go into it, it's not export limitations are not facilitating the overall production of vaccines, to the opposite, because they produce hiccups in the production chain.
It's 2 minutes over time, and I know a lot of people will have to leave. There is another question, which I will ask briefly here as they've written it. I mean, just to follow on from your discussion, some of what I had heard is that one of the problems with the EU coordination of buying vaccines is that they ordered 100 million German vaccines, and then the French said, you're not ordering any more until you order 100 million of the French, which didn't deliver. So this is one of the arguments, that there's a politics going on around who's buying whose vaccines. But we can discuss that another time over a long glass of wine. Mark Cassell is the last question. I'm not sure if Mark is still here. But anyway, he says, where is politics in your understanding of historical juncture? I think you've mentioned that a bit in your last response. And he asks, wouldn't the rise of right-wing nationalism in wealthy and poor countries constitute an historical juncture regardless of COVID?
I mean, I don't see a linear development there. In fact, if you look at the support and the resonance to right-wing, narratives and so on, it fell in the beginning of the pandemic. And as we discussed yesterday, it rose again when it became clear that this wasn't an exceptional situation, but it was basically, something that would stay. So for me, this is not a linear trend. It depends on how right-wing political parties can really capitalize on what is happening, right? So they are responding. They're using. I mean, we know that they have the ideology, but they use certain issues like, I don't know, lack of democracy in the European Union or problems with the euro to mobilize for their kind of ideologies. And these topics on which they mobilize can vary. So I wouldn't see this as a linear trend. I would see this as an ebb and flow. What I see more is a kind of refocus on national matters on which they again capitalize. And that goes back to your question, Jackie. I mean, this kind of thinking about also promoting your own vaccine producer is also kind of a classical, national industrial policy in face of a transboundary threat of enormous challenges, and that's the thing that really puzzles me, that you can say, okay, there's a lack of solidarity in the world with other countries, but I mean, I see a lack of self-interest here because it will hit back, and that's the negative news. And I'm still struggling to explain that fully because I'm puzzled by it. I remain puzzled by this. Sorry.
Well, can I thank you on behalf of all of us, first of all, for a really absolutely fascinating, really useful, empirical and conceptual discussion of these times we've been living through. And also, again, thank you for your role as president, because you have been outstanding in really making sure that the association will continue on to Amsterdam. So we hope to see you all there. And while you want a little break, you may like to come to the next presidential panel, which is happening at 7 o'clock, where we'll be talking about good old Brexit. What next? So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And million thanks to you, Sigrid.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you for all the questions. And I hope we can follow up on these with discussions elsewhere. Thank you.